Arthur Pringle was a man of systems. He believed that the universe was a giant clock, and if one could only find the right screwdriver, one could adjust the ticking of destiny to a more manageable pace. He lived in the village of Upper Netheridge, a place where the hills rolled with such deliberate gentleness that they seemed to be doing it on purpose to avoid upsetting the sheep. Arthur's life was a sequence of carefully curated habits. His tea was brewed for exactly 4 minutes, his socks were organized by the shade of grey, and he never, under any circumstances, engaged in what he called unnecessary emotional expenditure. To Arthur, the heart was a purely biological pump, an industrious little engine that had no business fluttering like a trapped moth just because someone had smiled in its general direction. He often told his cat, a stoic tabby named Copernicus, that emotions are merely chemical spills in the laboratory of the soul. Copernicus usually responded by licking his own paw, which Arthur took as a sign of profound intellectual agreement. Then came Elara Vance. Elara did not have a system, she had a whirlwind. She arrived in Upper Netheridge in a puff of exhaust smoke from a vintage Morris Minor that looked like it was held together by hope and several rolls of floral washi tape. She moved into the cottage next to Arthur's, the one with the overgrown ivy and the chimney that leaned slightly to the west, as if it were trying to eavesdrop on the village gossip. The first time Arthur saw her, he was measuring the height of his hedge with a wooden ruler. He liked his hedge to be exactly 52 inches tall. It was a height that commanded respect without being ostentatious. "You've missed a bit," a voice chirped. Arthur froze. He didn't like it when voices chirped. Voices should be level, resonant, and preferably predictable. He turned to see a woman with hair the color of a sunset that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be orange or pink. She was wearing a pair of dungarees covered in paint splatters and held a half-eaten lemon drizzle cake in one hand. "I beg your pardon," Arthur said, his ruler poised like a weapon. "The corner near the gate," she said, gesturing with the cake. "It's leaning. It looks like it's trying to make a run for it. I'm Elara, by the way. I've moved into number 4. I hope you don't mind loud jazz and the occasional smell of turpentine. I'm an artist. You see, well, I'm a person who puts paint on things and hopes for the best. Is there a difference, philosophically speaking? I mean..." Arthur blinked. He felt as though a very bright light had been turned on in a room where he was trying to take a nap. "I am Arthur Pringle, and my hedge is structurally sound. Thank you." "Of course it is, Arthur," she grinned, and for a moment, the sunlight seemed to catch on her teeth in a way that made Arthur's biological pump do something very irregular. But wouldn't it be more exciting if it wasn't just a little bit of chaos to keep the atoms on their toes? Arthur watched her retreat into her cottage, humming a tune that was definitely not in for quarters time. He returned to his hedge, but for the first time in 7 years, he accidentally cut a branch to 51.5 inches. He stared at the gap in horror. The system had been breached. Over the following weeks, Elara Vance became the ultimate exception to every rule Arthur had ever written for himself. Rule number 1: never engage in conversation before the first cup of Earl Grey has been fully consumed. Yet there he was, standing over his garden fence at 7:30 a.m., listening to Elara explain why she believed that clouds were actually the thoughts of giant, invisible sheep. "You see, Arthur," she said, leaning on her spade, "when they're fluffy and white, the sheep are thinking about clover. When they're dark and grey, they're wondering if they left the oven on." Arthur should have pointed out the meteorology of water vapor and atmospheric pressure. He had the textbooks, he had the charts. Instead, he heard himself say, "Then what are the pink ones at sunset?" Elara beamed. "Oh, those are the sheep thinking about their first crush. Very embarrassing, very rosy." Arthur felt a strange heat rise to his cheeks. He told himself it was the morning sun, though the sun was currently obscured by a very large, clover-thinking sheep. Arthur's pseudo-philosophy began to mutate. He had always thought that the purpose of life was to be a well-oiled cog, but Elara was like a handful of glitter thrown into the machinery. It was messy, it was impossible to clean up, and occasionally it made everything sparkle in a way that was quite distracting. He began to observe her with the clinical detachment of a scientist, or so he told himself. He noticed that she never wore matching socks. One would be striped, the other polka-dotted. He noticed that she talked to the bumblebees in her garden, calling them sir and madam and asking them if the pollen was particularly vintage this year. "It's illogical," Arthur whispered to Copernicus one evening. "She has no plan. She eats dessert before dinner if she feels like it. She thinks the moon is a giant pearl that someone dropped. And yet, she seems to be functioning at a high level of happiness. Is it possible?" "Copernicus, that gravity works differently for people like her." Copernicus yawned. The turning point came on a Tuesday, the day Arthur usually dedicated to filing his receipts and reflecting on the inevitability of entropy. It was raining, a proper British drizzle that felt like the sky was being passive-aggressive. Arthur was perfectly content inside, watching the droplets race down the window pane. He always bet on the one on the left. Then he saw her. Elara was in her garden, without an umbrella, trying to paint the rain. She looked like a drowned kitten with a paintbrush. Arthur's internal alarm system went off. Proximity to moisture leads to oxidation and the common cold. His brain shouted, "Stay inside. Maintain the dry perimeter." But his feet had other ideas. Before he knew it, he was outside, holding his large, sensible black umbrella over her and her canvas. "You'll catch your death," he said, his voice sounding uncharacteristically wobbly. Elara looked up, her face streaked with blue paint and rainwater. She looked beautiful. It was a terrifying realization. She wasn't symmetrically pleasing or mathematically balanced. She was just Elara, an exception to the laws of aesthetics. "Arthur, you're rescuing me," she laughed. "Look at the way the water hits the cobalt blue. It's like the sky is crying because it's so pretty." "The sky is crying because of a low-pressure system moving in from the Atlantic," Arthur corrected, though he held the umbrella firmer. "No," she said, stepping closer to him to stay under the canopy. She smelled like peppermint and damp earth. "It's crying because it can't come down here and have tea with us. Do you have any biscuits, Arthur? The sort that make a loud snap when you bite them?" Arthur did have those biscuits. They were stored in an airtight tin, arranged by their sugar content. I suppose I could facilitate a biscuit-related event. That afternoon, in Arthur's pristine kitchen, the system collapsed entirely. Elara sat on his counter on the counter and told him stories about her life as a traveling muralist. She spoke of the colours of the desert and the way the wind sounded in the Scottish Highlands. Arthur listened, his tea going cold, a crime he hadn't committed since 2012. He found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone. He told her about his fear of the number 13 and his secret belief that if he didn't tap his teapot 3 times, the tea wouldn't taste right. "I'm a bit ridiculous, aren't I?" Arthur asked, looking down at his perfectly polished shoes. Elara hopped off the counter and took his hand. Her hand was small and warm, and it felt like a tiny bird had decided to nest in his palm. "Arthur Pringle, you aren't ridiculous. You're just a masterpiece that's spent too much time in a very tidy box. You think the world is a problem to be solved, but it's actually a dance to be tripped through." "I don't like tripping," Arthur whispered. "It's undignified." "Then trip with me," she said softly. "It's much more fun when you have someone to catch you." In that moment, Arthur realized something profound. He had spent his whole life trying to be the rule, the standard, the constant. But in the grand equation of existence, he didn't want to be a constant anymore. He wanted to be the variable. He wanted to be the thing that changed when she entered the room. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a warm, bubbling glow that defied all known laws of thermodynamics. It was a first heartbeat, or at least, the first one that felt like it belonged to him rather than a biological pump. "I think," Arthur said, his voice thick with a sincerity that frightened him, "that my system might be fundamentally flawed." "Oh," Elara tilted her head, a stray lock of pinkish hair falling over her eye. "Yes, I had a rule that said I should only care about things that are predictable. But you are the most unpredictable person I have ever met, and yet, I find myself wanting to ensure that you always have an umbrella, and biscuits, and someone to tell you that the clouds are indeed sheep." Elara's eyes softened, turning a shade of green that Arthur decided was his new favorite color, replacing dove gray. "Am I an exception, then?" "You," Arthur said, reaching out to awkwardly but tenderly tuck that stray lock of hair behind her ear, "are the only exception." The weeks that followed were a blur of glorious, terrifying chaos. Arthur learned that life was much more interesting when you didn't know what was going to happen at 4 p.m. He started wearing socks that were only mostly the same color. He let Copernicus sit on the dining table. He even bought a jar of marmalade that wasn't the brand his family had used for 3 generations. He and Elara became a common sight in Upper Netheridge. He, the tall, slightly stiff man in the well-pressed coat, and she, the vibrant splash of color trailing laughter behind her. One evening, they sat on a bench overlooking the valley. The air was cool, smelling of cut grass and the coming autumn. Arthur was thinking about the universe again. A lot. She was leaning her head on his shoulder, sketching a tree that looked suspiciously like it was dancing. "I've been thinking about the stars. Scientists say they are giant balls of burning gas millions of miles away." "And what do you think they are, Professor Pringle?" she teased. Arthur looked up at the twinkling sky. "I think they are holes in the floor of heaven, where the light leaks through because someone forgot to finish the tiling. And I think I'm glad the tiling is unfinished, because if everything were perfect, we wouldn't be able to see the light." Elara put down her sketchbook and looked at him. That was almost poetic. "Arthur, are you feeling all right? Do you need a thermometer?" Arthur laughed a real, belly-shaking laugh that startled a nearby owl. "I feel perfectly imperfect. It's a very strange sensation, like my heart has grown 3 sizes and is now wearing a very loud, yellow raincoat." He turned to her, his expression turning serious in that sincere way that only someone who had lived a very quiet life could manage. "I spent so long being afraid of the world because I couldn't control it. I thought that if I kept everything in its place, I would be safe, but safety is just a different word for standing still, and I don't want to stand still anymore. I want to go wherever you're going, even if we get lost, especially if we get lost." Elara took his face in her hands. Her fingers were stained with yellow ochre. "We will definitely get lost, Arthur. I have a terrible sense of direction. I once tried to go to the post office and ended up in a different county." "That's quite all right," Arthur smiled. "I'll bring the map, but I'll let you hold it upside down if you want." "It's a deal." As the moon rose over the Cotswolds looking, as Elara insisted, like a giant lemon drop, Arthur Pringle finally understood the true nature of the universe. It wasn't a clock, it wasn't a machine. It was a story, and stories didn't need to be logical, they didn't need to follow a system, they just needed to be shared. He wasn't the man who counted his socks anymore, he was the man who loved a woman who painted the rain. And in the grand, messy, beautiful library of the world, that was the only entry that truly mattered. They sat there for a long time, to quiet figures against the vastness of the night. Arthur didn't check his watch once. He didn't think about the time, or the temperature, or the probability of a frost. He just felt her hand in his, the steady rhythm of their breathing, and the wonderful, terrifying, glorious knowledge that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. A lot. "Yes, Arthur. I think I might be having a chemical spill in the laboratory of the soul right now." She giggled and kissed his cheek. Good, let it stain. Arthur, some stains are much better than a clean floor. And as they walked back to their leaning cottages, hand in hand, Arthur Pringle decided that he quite liked the mess. He liked the exceptions. But most of all, he liked the way his heart beat not like a pump, not like an engine, but like a bird that had finally found the sky. The village of Upper Netheridge slept on, its hills rolling, its sheep dreaming of clover, and its stars leaking light through the floor of heaven. Everything was in its place, but for Arthur, the place had changed. It wasn't a coordinate on a map or a time on a clock, it was simply wherever she was. For in a world of 7 billion people and an infinite number of rules, she was the only one who had taught him how to break them, and that, he decided, was the most profound philosophy of all. The following morning, the sun did not so much rise as it did politely announce its presence through a thick, milky veil of Gloucestershire mist. In the kitchen of his cottager's space that had once been a temple to the god of linear organisation, Arthur Pringle stood before his kettle. Usually, this was a 3-minute process governed by the laws of thermodynamics and the precise measurement of tea leaves. Today, however, there was a smudge of yellow paint on the handle of his favourite ceramic mug. He looked at it. Under the old regime, the Arthur of the alphabetized larder, this smudge would have been a crisis. It was a breach of protocol. It was a foreign substance in a sterile environment. But as he waited for the water to reach its boiling point, Arthur found himself tracing the outline of the yellow stain with his thumb. It felt like a secret message from another world. It was a reminder that Elara had been here, waving her paint-stained hands about as she explained why the hills looked more like melted emeralds than geological formations. A smudge, Arthur whispered to the empty kitchen, is simply a memory that refuses to be wiped away. He nodded to himself, quite pleased with this observation. He felt it was the sort of thing a philosopher might say if they had spent too much time sniffing linseed oil. He took his tea into the garden. The grass was heavy with dew, soaking through his sensible leather slippers almost immediately. Old Arthur would have retreated, fearing for the structural integrity of the cowhide. New Arthur, the one currently wearing a yellow raincoat in his soul, simply wiggled his toes. The cold was sharp, tingling, and undeniably real. A magpie landed on the stone wall, eyeing him with a look of profound suspicion. "Good morning," Arthur said. "One for sorrow, usually, but since I am currently a man of many exceptions, I shall count you as one for unexpected biscuits." The bird chirped and flew away. Arthur watched its flight, thinking about the trajectory. It wasn't a straight line. It was a series of dips and swoops, a chaotic dance through the air. He realized then that his entire life had been a series of straight lines drawn on a map that nobody else was using. Elara was the one who had taken a crayon to his map and drawn a giant, swirling sun right over the danger, uncharted territory section. He walked over to the hedge that separated his garden from hers. It was a wild, overgrown thing, mostly because Elara believed that trimming a hedge was a form of horticultural censorship. Her voice came from somewhere near the compost heap. A moment later, her head popped up. She was wearing a woolen hat with two mismatched pom-poms and was holding a trowel as if it were a royal scepter. "Elara, you're up early." "The light was shouting at me," she said, wiping a streak of mud across her forehead. "It was saying, 'Elara, look at the way the fog is hugging the turnips. I couldn't ignore a shouting turnip, could I?'" Arthur leaned against the gate, the damp was seeping into his cardigan. "I suppose not. Though I've always found root vegetables to be rather taciturn. I've been thinking, Elara." "Oh dear, that sounds like a long-distance journey. Where did you go?" "I went to the land of logic," Arthur said, his eyes twinkling. "And I found that it has a very poor climate, very dry, no room for shouting turnips or yellow raincoats. I've decided that I want to spend more time in the province of the peculiar with you." Elara climbed over the low stone wall, her movements fluid and careless. She landed in his garden with a soft thud and immediate laughter. She smelled of earth, lavender, and that faint, sharp scent of turpentine that seemed to follow her like a loyal pet. The province of the peculiar has very high taxes, you know, she warned, tucking her arm into his. You have to pay in lost buttons and silly songs. I have a surplus of lost buttons, Arthur replied gravely. I found 3 behind the sideboard yesterday. I believe they belonged to a waistcoat I haven't worn since 1994. It was a very beige year. They walked together toward the village square. Upper Netheridge was waking up. Mrs. Higgins was shaking out a rug outside the post office, and the local butcher, Mr. Penhaligon, was arranging sausages with the grim determination of a man preparing for battle. Arthur felt a strange sense of detachment from the routine. For years, he had been part of this clockwork village, a cog that turned exactly 36 times a minute. Now, he felt like he had been removed from the machine, polished, and put back in sideways. He didn't fit the slot anymore, and the sensation was intoxicating. Look at that, Elara pointed to a puddle in the middle of the road. What do you see? Arthur looked, a collection of rainwater mixed with silt, and perhaps a trace of motor oil from Mr. Penhaligon's van. Elara sighed, a dramatic, theatrical sound. Arthur, you're using your measuring eyes again. Look with your magic eyes. Arthur squinted. He tried to let his gaze soften, the way he did when he was trying to find a hidden pattern in a complex equation. The surface of the puddle shimmered. The grey sky was reflected in it, but the oil created a swirl of iridescent colour pinks, greens, and violets dancing on the surface of the murky water. It's a galaxy, Arthur whispered. A tiny, petrol-scented galaxy trapped in a pothole. Exactly, Elara squeezed his arm. Everything is something else if you look at it long enough. A tea kettle is a steam engine for fairies. A library is a graveyard where the ghosts talk to you from the pages. And you, Arthur Pringle. Yes, you are a very sturdy oak tree that has suddenly decided it wants to be a willow and learn how to bend. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. It was an uncomfortable, wonderful sensation. He thought about the years he had spent being sturdy. He had been the man people came to for facts, for figures, for the correct spelling of onomatopoeia. He had been a man of stone. But stone, he realized, eventually crumbles into dust. Willow trees, however, could survive the wind because they didn't try to fight it. I think, Arthur said, his voice a little thick, that bending is much more efficient than breaking. I spent 50 years trying not to break. I didn't realize I was allowed to just lean. They stopped by the village fountain, a moss-covered stone structure that hadn't worked since the Great Frost of '82. Elara hopped up onto the rim, balancing precariously. Let's go to the sea, she said suddenly. Arthur blinked. The sea, Elara, the coast is at least 2 hours away. I haven't checked the tire pressure on the rover. I haven't packed a thermos. I don't have my seaside hat. We don't need a seaside hat. We have our heads. And the rover has wheels, doesn't it? Wheels go round. That's their whole philosophy. Arthur felt the old panic rise, the need for a list, a map, a contingency plan for rain. But then he looked at Elara. She was standing on the edge of a non-functional fountain, her pom-pom hat wobbling in the breeze, looking at him with such absolute faith that he felt he could jump off a cliff, and she would simply paint him some wings on the way down. The rover, Arthur said, his voice gaining strength, is currently parked in the lane. It has a full tank of petrol, because I am a man who dislikes the lower half of a fuel gauge, I believe. Yes. I believe we should go. Right now, before I remember that I was supposed to defrost the freezer. The drive was unlike any journey Arthur had ever taken. Usually, he drove at exactly 45 miles per hour, checking his mirrors every 12 seconds. Today, he found himself humming. He found himself pointing out clouds that looked like teapots. "Do you think," Arthur asked as they passed a field of disinterested cows, "that the cows ever get tired of being cows? Do they ever look at the sheep and think, 'Gosh, I wish I had that much wool'?" Elara laughed, her head leaning out of the window, letting the wind toss her wild hair. "I think cows are very zen, Arthur. They just are. They are the monks of the meadow. They don't want wool. They just want to be the best possible versions of grass processing units they can be." "I see, and what am I?" Arthur asked, "in the great meadow of life?" Elara pulled her head back inside and looked at him. Her eyes were soft, a deep, mossy green that seemed to hold all the secrets of the woods. "You're a rare species, Arthur. You're a curious gentleman. Most people stop being curious when they learn how to tie their shoelaces. They think they know everything they need to know. But you're rediscovering the world as if someone just took the plastic wrapping off it." They reached the coast by mid-afternoon. The Bristol Channel was a moody, slate-grey expanse, the waves crashing against the pebbles with a sound like 1,000 glass marbles being spilled. The wind was fierce, smelling of salt and ancient things. Arthur stepped out of the car and felt the wind hit him. It was violent and chaotic. It didn't care about his neatly combed hair or his buttoned-up coat. It reached inside him and shook the dust off his heart. "It's very loud," he shouted over the roar of the tide. "It's the earth breathing," Elara shouted back, running toward the water's edge. Arthur followed her, his shoes crunching on the shingle. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of joyous sensation so intense it was almost painful. He thought of his father, a man who had worn a tie even on Sundays, a man who had told Arthur that life is a series of obligations to be met with dignity. "Sorry, Father," Arthur thought, "but dignity is currently a distant second to the way the salt feels on my skin." Elara was picking up stones, inspecting them with the intensity of a diamond merchant. "Look at this one, Arthur, it's perfectly round, like a tiny moon." She handed it to him. The stone was cold and smooth, worn down by millions of years of patient water. "It's been travelling for a long time," Arthur said, turning it over in his hand. "Probably longer than the British Empire, longer than the concept of tea. It's been tossed about, broken, smoothed, and pushed around by forces it couldn't see, and yet, here it is, perfectly round, perfectly finished." He looked at Elara. "I think I'm a stone, Elara. I've been in the water for a long time, but I only just realized I was being shaped." She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "We're all being shaped, Arthur. The trick is to enjoy the splashing." They sat on a piece of driftwood, watching the tide come in. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a long, golden bridge across the water. It was a scene so beautiful it felt like a cliché, but Arthur didn't care. He realized that clichés were only clichés because they were true. "Arthur." "Yes, Elara. I'm glad I moved into the cottage next to yours. I think if I'd moved next to a normal person, I would have been very bored. I would have had to talk about the weather in a sensible way." Arthur took her hand. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm. "I would have been very safe," he said quietly. "I would have had a very clean kitchen and a very quiet soul, and I would have died without ever knowing that the stars are holes in the floor of heaven." He looked at her, his heart doing that strange, fluttering thing that he now recognized as the loud yellow raincoat effect. "I think I love you, Elara, in a very unscientific, highly improbable, and statistically significant way." Elara didn't laugh. She didn't tease him. She simply leaned over and rested her head on his shoulder. "I know, Arthur. I've known since you tried to explain the golden ratio of my toast. You don't love like other people. You love like a man who has just found the missing piece of the universe and is terrified of losing it behind the sofa." "I won't lose it," Arthur promised. "I'll stick it to the fridge with a very strong magnet." As the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, they sat together in the cold, the wind howling around them. Arthur Pringle, the man who used to count his socks, felt a profound sense of peace. He realized that life wasn't about the arrival at a destination. It wasn't about the finished painting or the completed equation. It was about the smudge of yellow on the mug. It was about the salt on the skin. It was about the courage to be lost in the province of the peculiar with someone who didn't mind holding the map upside down. "Shall we go home?" Elara asked eventually. "I think the turnips are probably missing us." "Yes," Arthur said, standing up and brushing the sand from his trousers, an old habit he couldn't quite shake, though he did it with less vigor than before. "Let's go home. I have some very important things to do." "Like what?" "Like leaving the dishes in the sink for at least an hour, and perhaps I shall write a poem. It will be a very bad poem, Elara. It won't rhyme, and the meter will be appalling." She laughed, the sound echoing off the cliffs. "Those are the best kind, Arthur, the ones that don't fit the lines." And as they walked back to the rover, silhouetted against the dying light, Arthur Pringle knew that his lines were gone for good. He was a man of curves, of spills, and of beautiful, glorious exceptions, and as he started the engine, he didn't check the clock. He just looked at the woman beside him and drove into the dark, perfectly content to see where the road might lead. The gears of the old rover groaned in a way that would have previously caused Arthur a great deal of dental anxiety, but tonight, the sound was merely the car's way of clearing its throat before telling a story. He shifted into third as they climbed the winding lane that cut through the sleeping hills of the Cotswolds, the hedgerows looming on either side like soft green giants guarding the secrets of the night. The headlights flickered, a rhythmic pulsing that suggested the battery was considering a career change, yet Arthur simply hummed a tune that didn't quite exist. Beside him, Elara had kicked off her boots. Her feet, clad in thick, woolen socks of an aggressive shade of magenta, were propped up on the dashboard. In his former life, the one governed by spreadsheets and the strict adherence to the manufacturer's manual, this would have been an act of unspeakable domestic terrorism. Now, it just seemed like the most logical place for magenta socks to be. "Do you think the stars feel lonely, Arthur?" she asked, her voice drifting through the scent of salt and old leather. "They're so far apart. If they were people, they'd never even be able to pass the salt at dinner." Arthur considered this. He looked through the windscreen at the vast, indigo canopy above. "I suspect," he said, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel, "that stars are quite content with their personal space. Gravity is their version of a very long, very invisible hug. They don't need to pass the salt because they are made of the very thing that makes the salt. It's all rather efficient, if you think about it." "You're doing it again," she teased, her eyes glinting in the dashboard glow. "Doing what?" "Using science to explain away the poetry. It's like trying to describe a hug by calculating the pressure per square inch of rib cage. It's accurate, but it misses the bit that makes you want to cry." Arthur slowed the car as a fox darted across the road, a flash of russet and white tail tip. "Perhaps the poetry is in the accuracy, Elara. Perhaps the fact that the universe bothers to follow rules at all is the most romantic thing about it. It means the sun doesn't just show up by accident. It shows up because it made a promise 4.5 billion years ago." He felt quite proud of that. It felt deep. It felt like the sort of thing a man with a messy kitchen and a soul full of stars would say. "A promise," Elara whispered, tasting the word. "I like that. The sun is the only thing that never breaks a promise, even when it's raining. It's just hiding behind a curtain, waiting for its cue." They reached the crest of the hill, and the lights of their small village flickered below like a handful of spilled sequins. Arthur's cottage, a squat, stone affair with a chimney that leaned slightly to the left, sat nestled against Elara's more exuberant dwelling, which currently featured a string of fairy lights draped over a dead rosebush. As he pulled into the gravel drive, the engine gave one final, triumphant wheeze and fell silent. The sudden stillness was immense. It was the kind of silence that had weight, the kind that made you realize how much noise you usually carry around in your head. "We're back," Arthur said, though it was obvious. "Are we?" Elara turned to him, her face framed by the wild tangles of her hair. "Or are we just starting?" Arthur felt that familiar flutter in his chest. It wasn't indigestion, though his dinner of tinned sardines and crackers had been questionable. It was the sensation of a man who had spent his whole life standing on the shore, finally deciding to step into the water without checking the temperature first. "I think," he said softly, "that I've been back for 42 years. I'd quite like to go somewhere else now." They climbed out of the car, the gravel crunching under their feet with a sound like breakfast cereal. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and the damp, earthy promise of a British autumn. Arthur walked Elara to her door, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to stop them from shaking. "The poem," she reminded him, leaning against her door frame. Her coat was slightly damp from the sea spray, and she looked, to Arthur, like the most beautiful catastrophe he had ever witnessed. "You promised a very bad poem." Arthur cleared his throat. He looked at the wonky chimney of his house, then at the moon, then at the way Elara's nose turned up at the end. "There once was a man named Pringle," he began, his voice a bit thin, "who lived his life in a jingle of numbers and lines and very straight pines until his heart started to tingle." Elara stared at him, the silence stretched out, long and thin. "That was truly appalling, Arthur," she said, her face breaking into a wide, joyous grin. "The meter was a disaster. The rhyme was lazy. It's the worst thing I've ever heard." "I told you," he said, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. "I'm a beginner at being bad at things. It takes practice to be truly mediocre when you've spent so long trying to be perfect." "Well, you're a natural," she said, stepping forward and kissing him on the cheek. Her skin was cool, but the spot where her lips touched felt like it had been brushed by a toasted marshmallow. "Good night, Arthur. Don't do the dishes. Let them soak in their own importance." "Good night, Elara." He watched her go inside, the yellow light of her hallway spilling out onto the path before the door clicked shut. He stood there for a long time, looking at the wood of her door as if it might reveal the secrets of the universe. When he finally entered his own cottage, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty, it was full of the echoes of the day. He walked into his kitchen. The sink was indeed full of dishes. Usually, the sight of a dirty plate was enough to trigger a minor existential crisis, a feeling that if the kitchen wasn't ordered, the stars might fall out of the sky. He walked over to the sink, picked up a mug with a chip in the rim, and looked at it. "You're a messy bit of ceramic, aren't you?" he murmured. He set it back down. He didn't reach for the sponge. Instead, he went to his small desk in the corner of the living room, the desk where he usually balanced his checkbook and filed his receipts in chronological order. He took out a clean sheet of paper. He picked up a pen. He didn't write a list. He didn't draw a graph. He thought about the province of the peculiar. He thought about the way Elara looked when she was explaining that clouds were just the ghosts of evaporated puddles. "The world is not a box," he wrote, his handwriting looping and uneven. "It is a spilled bag of marbles, rolling in directions we cannot predict. Some are shiny, some are cracked, and some are lost under the sideboard, but they are all moving." He stopped. He looked at the sentence. It was pseudo-philosophical rubbish. It was the kind of thing people wrote on the back of herbal tea boxes. And yet, as he sat there in the dim light of a single lamp, Arthur felt a profound sense of truth in it. He realized that his father's obligations met with dignity were really just a way of staying dry in a world that was meant to be rained on. Dignity was just a raincoat that was too tight. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the cottage next door. A single light was on in the upstairs window. Elara was there, probably brushing her hair with a fork or reading a book upside down to see if the ending changed. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability. It was terrifying, this business of being open. It was like living without a roof. You got a better view of the lightning, but you also got very wet. "I'm wet," Arthur whispered to the empty room. "I'm absolutely soaked." He went to his bedroom, leaving the kitchen light on. He left his shoes in the middle of the floor instead of putting them on the rack. He didn't even fold his trousers. He felt like a rebel, a suburban Che Guevara in corduroy. As he lay in bed, the darkness of the room felt soft. He thought about the stone Elara had given him, the tiny moon worn smooth by the sea. He realized that he didn't want to be a finished stone anymore. He didn't want to be perfectly finished. He wanted to keep being tossed about. He wanted the jagged edges. He wanted the splashing. Tomorrow, he decided, he would buy a plant, not a sensible one like a spider plant or a cactus that required no emotional investment. He would buy something temperamental and dramatic. A fern, perhaps, something that needed misting and whispering and might die if he looked at it sideways. He would learn to live with the possibility of failure, because as Elara had shown him, the only real failure was staying exactly the same while the world was busy turning itself into something new. Arthur Pringle closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't count sheep to fall asleep. He counted the different shades of yellow he had seen that day, the raincoat, the gorse on the cliffs, the light in her window. And as he drifted off, he decided that yellow was the most important color in the periodic table of the heart. It was the color of things that refused to be ignored. It was the color of exceptions. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window pane of the cottage. In the kitchen, the dishes sat in the dark, unwashed and unbothered. The turnips in the garden grew in their own silent, earthy way, indifferent to the dramas of human hearts. And in the cottage next door, a woman with magenta socks turned out her light, knowing that the man next door had finally stopped trying to measure the rain and had started, at last, to feel it. The sun crawled over the horizon of St. Jude's under the hill with the slow, deliberate pace of a postman who knew he had far too many parcels to deliver and not nearly enough biscuits to fuel the journey. It poked a finger of pale, buttery light through the gap in Arthur Pringle's curtains, illuminating a sight that would have made the Arthur of 48 hours ago weep with tectonic despair. His shoes were still in the middle of the rug. They sat there like two leather islands in a sea of beige carpet, toes pointing at odd angles, defiant and unpolished. Arthur lay in bed, staring at them. He felt a strange, humming vibration in his chest, as if a very small bee had taken up residence in his ribcage and was currently trying to map out the local flora. It wasn't anxiety. He knew what anxiety felt like. It was a cold, grey lump of porridge in the stomach. This was different. This was fizzy. It was the sensation of a man who had accidentally discovered that the rules of gravity were merely a polite suggestion. "Right," he whispered to the ceiling. "The shoes stay. The bed remains unmade. We are living in a state of glorious, unmitigated peril." He climbed out of bed, purposefully stepping over the shoes rather than into them. He walked to the kitchen, where the sink was still a porcelain graveyard of yesterday's tea. He looked at the mug with the chip. It looked back at him, seemingly pleased with its own brokenness. Arthur decided that breakfast would not be the usual bowl of bran flakes, measured to the gram. Instead, he found a tin of peaches at the back of the cupboard bought in a moment of madness 3 years ago and a heel of crusty bread. He ate the peaches straight from the tin with a dessert spoon, standing up, while the bread toasted to a shade of brown that verged on charred remains. "If my father could see me now," Arthur muttered, juice trickling down his chin, "he would probably call for a priest or a surveyor, or both." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, another minor heresy, and looked out of the window. The garden next door was a riot of green and purple, a chaotic tapestry that Elara seemed to weave simply by existing near it. She was already out there, wearing a hat that appeared to be made entirely of dried lavender and old newspapers. She was crouched by a rosebush, talking to it. Arthur felt that familiar, lurching tug in his heart. It was a terrifying feeling, like being a kite that had suddenly realized the string was quite thin and the wind was quite strong. He needed to do something. He needed to participate in this new, messy world. He grabbed his coat, the sensible navy blue one, though he found himself wishing it were a more courageous shade of mustard, and headed out. He had a mission. He was going to buy a plant. St. Jude's under the hill was the kind of village where everyone knew everyone else's business, mostly because there wasn't much other business to know. The high street was a winding ribbon of cobblestones and shops with names like the Woolly Sheep and Boffin's Biscuits. Arthur walked with a new spring in his step, a gait that was almost a saunter. He nodded to Mrs. Higgins, who was sweeping her doorstep with the grim intensity of a woman purging the world of sin. "Morning, Mrs. Higgins," Arthur chirped. Mrs. Higgins stopped. She leaned on her broom, her eyes narrowing. "You've got a smudge of peach on your tie, Mr. Pringle, and your laces are untied." Arthur looked down. So they were. "It's a new aesthetic, Mrs. Higgins," he said, surprising himself with the word. "I'm experimenting with the concept of downward mobility. Good day." He left her blinking in the dust and ducked into Potter's Greenery, a shop that smelled of damp earth, crushed mint, and the quiet aspiration of subterranean life. Mr. Potter, a man who looked remarkably like a parsnip that had been left in the ground too long, was misting a row of petunias. "Mr. Pringle," Potter wheezed, "looking for the weed killer. The nettles in your back garden are starting to look like they're planning a coup." "No, Mr. Potter," Arthur said, standing tall. "I am looking for a plant, a difficult one. A plant with a personality disorder and a fragile ego." Mr. Potter stopped misting. He wiped his spectacles on his apron. "A difficult one. You usually go for the plastic ivy. Arthur, it's the only thing that fits your filing system." "The filing system has been archived," Arthur said, waving a hand vaguely. "I want something that requires a high level of emotional investment, something that might die if I play the wrong radio station." Potter led him to the back of the greenhouse, where the air was thick and humid, like a tropical sigh. He pointed to a small, delicate fern with fronds so thin they looked like they had been spun from emerald lace. It sat in a terracotta pot, looking immensely dissatisfied with its surroundings. "The maidenhair fern," Potter whispered, as if the plant might overhear. "She's a diva. She hates drafts. She hates direct sunlight. She hates being dry. But she'll rot if she's too wet. She once dropped all her leaves because I changed my brand of tea. She's a nightmare wrapped in a chlorophyll nightmare." Arthur stared at the fern. It was beautiful. It was ridiculous. It was exactly what he needed. "I'll take her," Arthur said, "and a spray bottle, the most expensive one you have. The one that produces a mist like a Victorian Moor at midnight." As he walked back home, cradling the fern in his arms as if it were a temperamental infant, Arthur felt a sense of profound accomplishment. He was now responsible for something that defied logic. He was a caretaker of the improbable. When he reached his garden gate, he saw Elara. She was sitting on the low stone wall that separated their properties, swinging her legs. She was holding a jar of something that looked suspiciously like blue glitter mixed with jam. "What have you got there, Arthur Pringle?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with that dangerous, lovely curiosity. "A catastrophe," Arthur said, holding up the fern. "Her name is Arabella, and she is currently considering whether or not to wither away out of sheer spite." Elara hopped off the wall, her magenta socks flashing in the sunlight. She leaned in close to the fern, her nose almost touching the delicate fronds. Arthur held his breath. He could smell her. She smelled like rain on hot pavement and pepperminty. "She is lovely," Elara whispered. "She just needs to know that you're not afraid of her. Ferns can smell fear. You know, it's why they're so common in dentists' waiting rooms." Arthur laughed. It was a genuine, rusty sound that felt like it had been scraped out of a forgotten drawer. I am terrified of her, Elara. I'm terrified of everything. I'm currently terrified of the fact that I didn't fold my trousers last night. Elara looked up at him, her expression softening into something so tender it made Arthur's knees feel like they were made of damp cardboard. Terrified is just another word for being awake, Arthur. Most people spend their lives sleepwalking in very well-pressed trousers. You're finally having a nightmare. It's much more interesting. Is that what this is? Arthur asked, looking at the fern and then back at her. A nightmare? The best kind, she said. She held out her jar. Do you want to help me? I'm making a map of forgotten wishes. I'm going to paint the fence with things people wanted to happen but didn't. Arthur looked at his fence, his perfectly painted, cream-coloured fence that he had meticulously maintained for 12 years. Then he looked at the blue glitter jam. I have a lot of wishes, Arthur said softly. Most of them involve things staying in the right place, but I think I'd like to add a new one. And what's that? Arthur took a deep breath. The bee in his chest was doing a celebratory jig. I wish to be the kind of man who doesn't mind a bit of blue glitter on his fence or his life. Elara handed him a paintbrush. It was a cheap, plastic thing, but to Arthur it felt like a scepter. The trick, Elara said, as he dipped the brush into the blue goo, is not to think about the straight lines. The universe doesn't have straight lines. It's all curves and zigzags and the occasional loop-de-loop. If you try to draw a straight line on a moving planet, you'll only end up disappointed. They spent the afternoon painting. Arthur's fence, once the bastion of suburban order, became a swirling nebula of cobalt and sparkles. He painted the wish to eat cake for dinner. He painted the wish to understand why birds sing at 4 a.m. He even painted the wish to be a little bit less like Arthur Pringle. As the sun began to dip, casting long, purple shadows across the grass, they sat on the grass Arthur's trousers be damned and looked at their handiwork. You know, Arthur said, wiping a streak of blue from his forehead, I used to think that the meaning of life was a series of checkboxes. If you ticked them all, you won, but I'm starting to think that the boxes are actually just cages. Elara leaned her head on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, light as a bird's wing, but it felt to Arthur like the weight of an entire world, a beautiful, chaotic, unmapped world. The boxes are for people who are afraid of the wind, she said, but you, Arthur, I think you're starting to like the breeze. It's a bit chilly, Arthur admitted, his old self flickering for a moment, but the view is much better. He looked at the maidenhair fern, sitting in its pot on the patio. It hadn't died yet. In fact, in the golden light of the evening, its leaves seemed to be reaching out, unfurling toward the mess, the glitter, and the man who was finally learning how to breathe. Arthur realized then that Elara wasn't just a neighbor or an eccentric whirlwind. She was a translation. She was translating the world for him, turning the cold, hard prose of his existence into poetry, the kind of poetry that didn't always rhyme and had far too many exclamation marks. But poetry nonetheless. Elara, he whispered. Yes, Arthur, I think I've lost my ruler. She chuckled, a sound like silver bells in a velvet bag. Good, you don't need it. You can't measure a heartbeat with an inch tape. He looked at her, at the glitter in her hair and the wisdom in her wild eyes. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the chipped mugs, the unwashed dishes, and the terrifying, wonderful vulnerability of being wet. The world was indeed a spilled bag of marbles. And as Arthur Pringle sat in the darkening garden of St. Jude's, under the hill, he decided that he didn't want to be the one who picked them up and put them back in the bag. He wanted to be the one who rolled along with them, bumping into things, getting scratched, and marveling at how far they could go if they just stopped trying to stay still. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, the silence wasn't a void to be filled with chores, it was a space to be filled with the quiet, messy, beautiful possibility of tomorrow. And tomorrow, he thought, he might even try a different kind of jam, maybe something with seeds. Seeds were the ultimate gamble. After all, you never knew where they might end up. Arthur smiled, a small, secret smile. He was a rebel in a cardigan, a philosopher of the mundane, and for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be, right in the middle of the beautiful, glittering muddle. The moon began its ascent over the gables of the old vicarage, looking for all the world like a discarded peppermint cream against the velvet indigo of the sky. Arthur Pringle watched it, his back leaning against the now sticky fence, and felt a strange sensation in his knees. It wasn't the usual damp-induced ache that dictated his choice of woolen socks. It was a lightness, as if his bones had been replaced by bubbles or perhaps very optimistic pieces of string. "Elara," he said, his voice sounding like it had been buffed with fine grit sandpaper, "I believe I have a glittery smudge on my soul, and I don't think I want to scrub it off." Elara didn't laugh. She simply adjusted her position on the grass, her patchwork skirt splayed out like a fallen kite. "Souls are meant to be smudged, Arthur. A clean soul is a soul that's spent too much time in the cupboard under the stairs. You have to take it out, let it get a bit of mud on the hem. Let the moths have a nibble. That's how you know it's been used." Arthur nodded solemnly. This was the sort of logic he would have once dismissed as unstructured nonsense, but now it felt as vital as a weather forecast. He looked at his hands. They were stained a deep, cosmic blue. For 60 years, he had been a man of beige. He had been a man of neutral tones and sensible choices. He had lived his life as if he were a delicate piece of porcelain, terrified that a single crack would render him useless. But sitting here, covered in jam and starlight, he realized that the cracks were where the music got in. "I used to think that if I followed all the instructions, the universe would owe me a prize," Arthur mused, his gaze drifting to the silhouettes of the oak trees. "I thought if I kept my hedges straight and my taxes paid and my emotions filed alphabetically, there would be a sort of grand certificate at the end, an award for excellence in not making a nuisance of himself." "And now?" Elara asked, her eyes reflecting the silver crescent above. "Now I think the universe doesn't even have a filing cabinet," Arthur whispered. "I think the universe is a toddler with a box of crayons, and we're all just lucky to be part of the drawing, even if we're just a scribble in the corner." He felt a sudden, sharp pang of affection for her, the kind of feeling that didn't fit into a checkbox. It was a messy, sprawling emotion that defied his previous understanding of human interaction. For Arthur, people had always been like variables in an equation. If you treated them with polite distance, the result was a stable, quiet life. But Elara was a division by zero. She broke the maths. She made the whole system collapse into something chaotic and brilliant. "You're a very peculiar person, Elara Vance," he said, the words feeling like a confession. "Thank you," she replied brightly. "Normality is a very expensive coat that doesn't actually keep you warm. I prefer my tatters." They sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that wasn't an absence of noise, but a presence of understanding. The village of St. Jude's under the hill breathed around them, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of the wind through the hedgerows, the soft hum of the earth. Arthur realized that he had spent his whole life trying to master the world, when he should have been learning how to dance with it. "Do you think," Arthur began, hesitating, "that it's too late to learn how to play the kazoo, or perhaps to start a collection of stones that look like minor celebrities?" Elara beamed at him, her smile a beacon in the twilight. "Arthur, it is never too late to be magnificently ridiculous. In fact, I think the older you get, the more of a duty you have to be absurd. It's a gift to the younger generation. It shows them that the finish line isn't a brick wall, it's a trampoline." Arthur stood up, offering her a hand. His movements were still a bit stiff. Habit was a difficult ghost to exorcise, but there was a new elasticity in his spirit. As he pulled her up, The blue glitter on their palms met, merging into a single, shimmering smear of shared history. "I have some biscuits in the tin," Arthur said, his voice regaining a bit of its usual clipped precision, though his eyes remained soft. "They are, I believe, slightly past their best before date. A week ago, I would have thrown them in the bin with a sense of moral superiority. And today, Arthur said, a mischievous glint appearing behind his spectacles, I think we should eat them with an alarming amount of butter and perhaps tell them stories about our travels." Elara laughed, and the sound seemed to stitch the night together. They walked toward the house, the man in the cardigan and the woman in the stars, leaving behind a fence that would undoubtedly become the scandal of the neighborhood by breakfast. As they reached the back door, Arthur paused. He looked back at his garden, at the maidenhair fern, and the swirling blue nebula on the wood. He realized that he didn't need to know what happened next. He didn't need a map, or a ruler, or a 5-year plan for his happiness. He was Arthur Pringle, a man who had finally discovered that the most important thing about a straight line is that it eventually has to end, whereas a circle, no matter how wobbly, goes on forever. Inside the kitchen, the kettle began to whistle, a cheerful, piercing sound that cut through the shadows. Arthur reached for the tea caddy, but his hand stopped. He looked at the plain white mugs, then at the jar of glitter Elara had left on the counter. With a deliberate, steady hand, he sprinkled a pinch of silver dust into the bottom of his teacup. "What are you doing?" Elara asked, peering over his shoulder. "I'm making a wish," Arthur replied, pouring the boiling water. "I'm wishing that I never find my ruler again. I'm wishing for more seeds in my jam. And I'm wishing," he turned to her, his heart beating a rhythm that was entirely unmeasured and wonderfully wild, "that I remain the only exception to my own rules." Elara smiled, and for the first time in his long, orderly life, Arthur Pringle didn't check the clock. He simply sat down in the beautiful, glittering muddle of the present and began to drink his tea. The biscuits were indeed a bit stale, but as he bit into one, he decided they tasted exactly like freedom. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering the last of the blue glitter across the lawn, a trail of breadcrumbs leading toward a tomorrow that promised to be absolutely, magnificently, beautifully messy.